When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not from fear of being caught, but from knowing what he would find. Those messages. The ones I forgot to delete. I tried to snatch the phone from his hands, but he pulled it back and kept reading. I watched his face change, line by line, and felt my life crumbling in seconds. Yes, now he would learn the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he scrolled further, and I knew, any moment now he'd reach that message, the one that would destroy my life. The one that would either explain everything or make it infinitely worse. My phone suddenly buzzed in his hands, and a new notification appeared on the screen. I saw his face pale as he read the sender's name. My husband froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit when I'm nervous. My nerves mixed with the horror of realizing what I had done. His breathing quickened. I could hear it even from 6 feet away. This was exactly what I feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the kind that changes everything forever, and now. I didn't know what to do, but let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I tried so hard to hide, write in the comments what city you're watching from, and answer this question: have you ever had a secret you tried desperately to keep, but ultimately couldn't? 23 years of marriage, and I could predict every word that would come out of Richard's mouth at dinner. Tonight would be no different. He'd mention the Henderson account, complain about traffic on Highway 12, and ask if I remembered to call the landscaper about the sprinkler system. The same conversations we'd been having for the past decade, like actors in a play that had run too long. I set his plate down, grilled salmon, asparagus, rice pilaf, and took my seat across from him at our mahogany dining table. The one we'd bought during our optimistic newlywed phase when we thought we'd host dinner parties and have meaningful conversations over candlelit meals. Now it felt like a conference table where we conducted the business of our marriage. The Henderson account closed today, Richard said, cutting into his salmon. Bigger commission than I expected. I nodded, spearing an asparagus spear. That's wonderful, honey. Traffic was hell on Highway 12. They really need to do something about that construction. Another nod. Did you call about the sprinklers? I'll do it tomorrow. This was our life. Predictable, stable, suffocating in its sameness. I looked around our pristine dining room, the cream walls I'd painted 3 years ago, the china cabinet displaying wedding gifts we never used, the landscape paintings that matched our color scheme but said nothing about who we were. Everything in its place, including me. At 47, I felt like a museum piece in my own home. The former literature professor who'd given up teaching when Richard's business took off, who'd traded Sylvia Plath and Virginia Woolf for grocery lists and dinner planning. Not that Richard ever asked me to quit, I'd convinced myself it was practical. One of us needed to manage the household, and his income was substantial enough to support us both. But sitting there, listening to him discuss quarterly projections, I felt the familiar hollow ache of wondering who I might have been. What conversations I might be having if I'd stayed at the university. What thoughts might fill my head if they weren't occupied with meal planning and dry cleaning schedules. The doorbell interrupted my spiral into self-pity. Expecting someone? I asked. Richard glanced at his watch. Actually, yes. I forgot to mention, David's coming to stay with us for a while. David? My nephew. Remember? Sarah's boy. He just finished art school and needs a place to land while he figures out his next move. I did remember David, vaguely. Sarah's son from her first marriage. I'd met him at a few family gatherings over the years, a quiet kid who always seemed to be sketching in the margins of his napkins or staring thoughtfully at nothing in particular. But that was years ago. He'd be what now? 25? 26? Richard was already walking toward the front door, and I could hear voices in the hallway. Deep, confident tones mixing with Richard's familiar baritone. I stayed at the table, suddenly conscious of my appearance. My hair was pulled back in the same ponytail I'd worn to clean the house, my face bare of makeup, my clothes practical and forgettable. They appeared in the doorway, and I had to catch my breath. The gangly teenager I remembered had transformed into something else entirely. Tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, wearing a vintage leather jacket over a simple white t-shirt. But it was his eyes that caught me, intelligent, observant, the kind that seemed to see more than they should. "You remember my wife," Richard was saying. "Of course." David's smile was warm, genuine. "Though I have to admit, you look exactly the same as you did 10 years ago." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. When was the last time anyone had complimented me? "You're very kind. And you've certainly grown up." "That's what happens when you're not paying attention," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me look at him more carefully. A hint of depth, of experiences beyond his years. Richard clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, I'll show you to the guest room. We can catch up properly tomorrow, early meeting in the morning." As they headed upstairs, I heard Richard explaining the house rules, the Wi-Fi password, where to find towels. But I found myself listening for David's responses, curious about this stranger who'd suddenly appeared in our carefully ordered world. I cleared the dinner dishes, but my mind kept wandering to the way David had looked at me, really looked, as if I were someone worth seeing. When was the last time Richard had looked at me that way? When was the last time anyone had? The guest room was directly above the kitchen, and I could hear the floorboards creaking as David moved around, unpacking probably. It was strange having another presence in the house, someone whose rhythms I didn't know, whose habits hadn't been catalogued and filed away in my mental inventory of predictable behaviors. I was loading the dishwasher when David appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Sorry to bother you," he said. Richard mentioned something about coffee in the morning, but I wanted to check if there was anything I should know about the household routine. "I don't want to be disruptive." "You're not bothering me at all." I turned to face him fully. "Coffee's in the cabinet above the pot. Help yourself to whatever you need." He leaned against the doorframe, and I noticed he'd changed into worn jeans and a gray sweater that brought out the color of his eyes. Richard seems to have quite a schedule. Early meetings, late dinners. That must be lonely for you. The observation caught me off guard. Not because it was intrusive, but because it was accurate, and because no one had ever acknowledged it before. "It's what I'm used to," I said carefully. "That doesn't mean it's what you want." Our eyes met, and for a moment, something passed between us. Understanding, maybe. Recognition. The feeling that here was someone who might actually see me, not just the role I'd been playing for so many years. "Well," he said, straightening up. "I should let you finish up here. Thank you for letting me stay. I promise I'll try to be the ideal houseguest." After he'd gone back upstairs, I stood in my kitchen, dish rag in hand, wondering why the house suddenly felt different. Why the familiar walls seemed to hum with new possibility. The morning routine proceeded as usual. Richard left at 7:30 sharp, travel mug in hand, pecking my cheek absently before rushing out to his car. But this morning, I found myself wondering what David's morning routine might be like. Did he wake early or sleep late? Did he drink coffee black or with cream? I got my answer at 9:15 when he appeared in the kitchen, hair tousled, wearing yesterday's jeans and a paint-stained t-shirt that somehow looked intentional rather than messy. "Good morning," he said, voice still rough with sleep. "I hope I didn't oversleep. I'm usually an early riser, but your guest bed is incredibly comfortable." "There's fresh coffee," I offered, already reaching for a mug. "And I was just about to make breakfast." Eggs? Toast? Just coffee's perfect. I'm not much of a breakfast person. He accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping his hands around it like it was a lifeline. But please, don't let me stop you from your routine. Honestly? I don't have much of a routine. The admission surprised me. Richard leaves so early, and I have time to fill. He studied me over his coffee cup. What did you do before? Richard mentioned you used to teach literature at the community college. I poured myself a fresh cup, using the motion to avoid his gaze. Medieval through contemporary poetry, mostly. Some creative writing workshops. What made you stop? The question everyone politely avoided asking. Practical reasons. Richard's business was growing, and someone needed to manage the household. It made sense. Did it? Make sense to you, I mean? I looked up sharply. He wasn't challenging me, exactly, but there was genuine curiosity in his expression. When was the last time someone had asked what I actually thought about my own life choices? At the time, yes. I set down my mug. Though I do miss it sometimes. The discussions, the discoveries. There's something magical about watching a student connect with a poem for the first time. What was your favorite to teach? Without hesitation, I said, Sylvia Plath. Ariel, specifically. Most people think her work is just dark, but there's such power in it. Such raw honesty about being a woman, about feeling trapped by expectations while yearning for something more. His eyes lit up. I know that collection. I am the arrow, the dew that flies suicidal, at one with the drive into the red eye, the cauldron of morning. I stared at him. You know Plath? I minored in literature. Art school wasn't all paint fumes and pretentious critiques. He grinned. Though there was plenty of both. But Plath, she understood something about creation and destruction being the same impulse. That's what I try to capture in my paintings. You paint? Oils, mostly. Some mixed media when I'm feeling experimental. He gestured vaguely upstairs. I brought a few pieces with me, if you'd ever like to see them. Though I should warn you, they're not exactly living room appropriate. For the first time in years, I felt genuine curiosity about another person's work. I'd love to see them. If you don't mind showing them. Right now? I glanced at the clock, 9:45 a.m. on a Tuesday. Richard wouldn't be home until 7. I had 8 hours ahead of me that I'd normally fill with errands, household tasks, maybe an hour of reading before starting dinner prep. The prospect of doing something different, something stimulating, felt almost dangerous. Why not? David's face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. Great. Fair warning though, my room might look like a tornado hit it. I'm not the world's neatest person. He wasn't exaggerating. The guest room looked like an art supply store had exploded. Canvases leaned against the walls, tubes of paint scattered across the dresser, brushes soaking in a mason jar filled with murky water. But somehow it felt alive in a way our perfectly organized house never did. Sorry about the chaos, he said, clearing a space on the bed for me to sit. I paint when I can't sleep, which is most nights lately. Why can't you sleep? He pulled 3 canvases from behind the dresser, considering my question. Transition anxiety, I guess. Art school was this protective bubble where everything was about learning and experimenting. Now I'm supposed to figure out how to make a living from what I love without compromising what made me love it in the first place. I understood that feeling more than he could know. May I? He turned the first canvas toward me, and I sucked in a breath. It was a woman's face, but fragmented, portions painted in hyperrealistic detail while others dissolved into abstract washes of color. Her eyes were ancient, knowing, but her mouth was unfinished, as if she were still trying to speak. "She's beautiful," I whispered. "She's searching," he corrected. I paint a lot of women searching for something. Voice, freedom, identity. Cliché, probably, but it's what comes out. The second painting was darker, a figure in a window, half in shadow, half in light. The third was pure abstraction, all swirling movement and emotional color. "These are incredible, David." "Truly." I looked up at him, and found him watching my reaction intently. "You have real talent. Not just technical skill, but vision. That's rare." "You really think so?" "I know so. I may not teach anymore, but I still recognize authentic artistic voice when I see it." We were sitting close now, the painting spread between us like a bridge. I could smell his soap, something clean and masculine that made me suddenly aware of my own proximity to him. When he reached across me to adjust one of the canvases, his arm brushed mine, and I felt an electric current I hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you," he said softly, "for understanding them. Most people see my work and ask if I can paint something for their living room. These belong in galleries, not living rooms." Our eyes met, and something shifted in the air between us. He was looking at me the way he looked at his paintings, like I was something worth studying, worth understanding. Like I had depths to explore. "You know," he said quietly, "I think you're as much of an artist as I am. The way you talked about Plath, about teaching, that's creative passion. Just because you're not practicing it doesn't mean it's gone." I'm not sure I remember how to be that person anymore. Maybe she's just waiting for the right moment to resurface. The space between us seemed to shrink. I was acutely aware of everything, the morning light filtering through the window, the smell of paint and possibility, the way he was looking at me like I was someone worth seeing. Really seeing. And then, without planning it, without thinking about consequences or propriety or the wedding ring on my finger, we kissed. It lasted only a moment before reality crashed back. I pulled away, my hand flying to my lips, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'm sorry," I whispered, standing abruptly. "I shouldn't have, this was a mistake." "Was it?" The question hung in the air as I fled the room, leaving him surrounded by his beautiful, searching women, all of them watching my retreat with knowing eyes. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the second floor entirely. I reorganized the pantry, scrubbed grout that didn't need scrubbing, and made an elaborate dinner that Richard barely noticed. Every time I heard footsteps overhead, my stomach clenched with a mixture of guilt and something else I didn't want to name. David didn't come downstairs until dinner, appearing in the dining room just as Richard was launching into a story about his latest client. He'd changed into khakis and a button-down shirt, looking respectable and safe, nothing like the intense artist who'd kissed me 12 hours earlier. "Sorry I'm late," he said, taking the seat across from me. "Lost track of time working on something." "No problem at all," Richard replied. "How was your first day? Getting settled okay? Your wife gave me the grand tour this morning. Showed me around, helped me get oriented." David's eyes met mine briefly. "She's an excellent hostess." I concentrated on cutting my chicken, hoping my face didn't reveal the heat spreading across my cheeks. The word hostess seemed loaded with meaning, though I was probably reading too much into it. "She's the best," Richard agreed absently, already checking his phone. "Did I mention I'll be out of town Thursday and Friday? Client presentation in Chicago. Will you be all right here on your own?" The question was directed at David, but I felt it like a physical blow. 2 days. Alone together. "I'll be fine," David answered. "Might give me a chance to explore the area a bit. Maybe visit some galleries, if there are any worth seeing." "There's a wonderful contemporary gallery downtown," I heard myself saying. They feature local artists, some really innovative work. Would you recommend it? Definitely. I realized both men were looking at me. The curator has excellent taste. Very forward-thinking. Maybe I'll check it out. Richard had already returned to his phone, typing with the focused intensity he brought to everything work-related. But David continued watching me, and I felt exposed, as if he could see every thought I was trying to suppress. After dinner, I escaped to the kitchen to clean up while Richard and David moved to the living room to watch the news. I could hear their voices, Richard explaining local politics, David asking thoughtful questions. Normal nephew and uncle conversation. Nothing that should make my hands shake as I loaded the dishwasher. But normal was the last thing I felt. Every ordinary action, rinsing plates, wiping counters, setting out tomorrow's coffee filters, felt charged with tension. I was hyper-aware of David's presence in the house, of the weight of what had happened between us, of how easily I'd crossed a line I'd never imagined crossing. I'd been married to Richard for 23 years. I'd never even been tempted to stray, never fantasized about other men, never questioned my commitment. I was the reliable wife, the steady partner, the woman who kept their life running smoothly while Richard built his career. So why was I standing in my kitchen, touching my lips and remembering the feel of another man's mouth on mine? Need any help in there? I spun around to find David in the doorway, dish towel in hand. Oh. No, I'm almost finished. I turned back to the sink, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. Instead, he moved closer. Richard fell asleep watching CNN. I didn't want to wake him. He works too hard, I said automatically, scrubbing a pan that was already clean. Do you ever tell him that? It wouldn't change anything. He loves his work. What about what you love? I set down the pan, gripping the edge of the sink. David, about this morning. You don't need to apologize. Yes, I do. I'm married. Happily married, I added, though the words felt false in my mouth. Are you? I turned to face him, anger flaring. You don't know anything about my marriage. You're right. I don't. He leaned against the counter, not coming closer but not retreating either. But I know what I saw this morning. The way you talked about teaching, about poetry. The way you came alive when you looked at my paintings. That wasn't the expression of a fulfilled woman. That's not fair. Neither is pretending you don't feel what I know you felt. The honesty in his voice stripped away my defenses. I wanted to deny it, to insist that what happened was meaningless, a momentary lapse. But standing there in my perfectly appointed kitchen, looking at this young man who saw things in me I'd forgotten existed, I couldn't lie. It doesn't matter what I felt, I said quietly. I made a commitment. I have a life here, responsibilities. What about responsibility to yourself? I'm 47 years old, David. I'm not some bored housewife looking for excitement. I'm a grown woman who knows the difference between fantasy and reality. And which am I? The question hung between us like a challenge. I wanted to say fantasy, to dismiss what was happening as a middle-aged woman's foolish infatuation with youth and artistic passion. But the way he was looking at me, with respect, with genuine interest, with desire that had nothing to do with pity or charity, made it impossible to reduce this to something simple. I don't know, I admitted. He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since our kiss. That's the most honest thing you've said since I got here. David. I'm not asking you for anything, he interrupted gently. I'm not trying to seduce you or break up your marriage or turn your life upside down. I'm just here. And so are you. And maybe that's enough for now. He set the dish towel on the counter and started to leave, then paused in the doorway. For what it's worth, he said without turning around, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since I arrived. And not just because of this morning. You're remarkable. I hope someday you remember that. After he left, I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the debris of another perfectly ordinary evening. The dishwasher hummed its familiar tune, the refrigerator cycled on with its reliable wheeze, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10 o'clock. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except for the woman standing in the middle of it all, finally understanding that she'd been sleepwalking through her own life for years. And now someone had woken her up. Richard stirred when I entered the living room, blinking at me with confused eyes. "Time for bed," he mumbled. "Past time," I agreed, helping him turn off the television. As we walked upstairs together, his hand briefly touching the small of my back in the gesture of casual intimacy we'd performed thousands of times, I thought about David's words. About responsibility to myself. About the difference between commitment and surrender. Richard fell asleep within minutes of hitting the pillow, his breathing settling into the steady rhythm I knew so well. But I lay awake staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of the guest room down the hall and the man who might be lying awake too, thinking about possibility and the dangerous territory between fantasy and reality. Richard left for Chicago Thursday morning with his usual efficiency, kiss on the cheek, reminder about the garbage pickup, promise to call when he landed. I stood in the doorway waving goodbye, playing the part of the devoted wife while my heart raced with anticipation I didn't want to acknowledge. David appeared in the kitchen an hour later, looking rumpled and beautiful in yesterday's clothes. "Sleep well?" I asked, pouring him coffee. "Not particularly." He accepted the mug gratefully. "Too much thinking." "About what?" "About whether you meant what you said Tuesday night. About this being just fantasy." I set down the coffee pot with unnecessary force. "David, we can't go to that gallery with me today." The request caught me off guard. "What?" "The one you recommended. I want to see it, and I'd like you to show it to me." "As friends," he added quickly. "Nothing more complicated than that." I should have said no. Should have manufactured some urgent household task, some reason why spending the day alone with him was impossible. Instead, I found myself nodding. "All right. But as friends." "As friends," he agreed, but his smile suggested we both knew how thin that line had become. The Meridian Gallery occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse downtown, its white walls and polished concrete floors providing the perfect backdrop for the kind of art Richard would never understand. I'd discovered it 3 years ago during one of my increasingly rare solo outings, and it had become my secret refuge, a place where I could remember who I used to be. "This is incredible," David said, studying a massive canvas covered in layers of oil paint and gold leaf. "The technique is flawless, but it's the emotional depth that gets me. You can feel the artist's struggle in every brushstroke." That's exactly what I thought when I first saw it. I moved closer to the painting, remembering my initial reaction. "Maria Santos is the artist. She's local, but her work deserves national attention." "You have an excellent eye." "I used to think so. Before I trailed off, not wanting to fall into the familiar pattern of self-pity." "Before you what?" "Before I convinced myself that appreciating art was a luxury I couldn't afford." David turned from the painting to study my face. "What convinced you of that?" I considered the question seriously. When had I stopped believing my opinions mattered? When had I started deferring to Richard's practical worldview, accepting his subtle dismissal of anything that couldn't be monetized? "I suppose I thought it was selfish," I said finally. "Spending time on things that didn't contribute to our household, our goals, our life together." "Whose goals?" The question stung because I couldn't answer it. Somewhere along the way, Richard's ambitions had become our ambitions, his definition of success the only one that mattered. I'd abdicated responsibility for my own dreams so gradually I hadn't noticed until they were gone. We spent 2 hours moving through the gallery, David asking thoughtful questions about pieces I'd studied during previous visits. He had the artist's way of seeing, noticing details others missed, understanding the technical challenges behind each work. But he also listened to my observations with genuine interest, building on my insights rather than dismissing them. "You should consider writing about art," he said as we examined a series of photographs exploring urban decay. "You have the analytical skills and the passion. There are dozens of publications that would welcome intelligent commentary from someone with your background. I don't have credentials in art history. You have something better. You have authentic response combined with intellectual rigor. That's rarer than credentials." Standing there in the filtered afternoon light, surrounded by work that challenged and inspired, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the desire to create, to contribute, to be more than a supporting player in someone else's story. "I used to write," I admitted. "Not about art, but creative pieces. Poems, short fiction. Nothing published, just personal work." "Do you still?" "No. I stopped years ago." "Why?" "Richard thought it was impractical. A hobby I'd outgrow." David's expression darkened. Did he actually say that? Not in so many words. But his reaction made it clear. He'd ask what I was hoping to accomplish, whether I thought I was good enough to make it worth the time investment. Eventually I just stopped. "That's criminal." The vehemence in his voice surprised me. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He's just practical, focused on tangible results. "And what about what's tangible to you?" Before I could answer, we were interrupted by the gallery owner, a sophisticated woman in her 60s who recognized me from previous visits. "How wonderful to see you again," she said warmly. "And with someone who clearly appreciates art." "Are you an artist yourself?" she asked David. "Painter, mostly. Still finding my voice." "Aren't we all?" She smiled knowingly. "If you're ever interested in showing your work, we have an open submission policy for local artists. Though I should warn you, I'm quite selective." "He's very talented," I said impulsively. "His work has real emotional depth, technical sophistication." "High praise from someone with your discerning eye," the woman replied, and I felt a flush of pride I hadn't experienced in years. After she moved on, David touched my arm lightly. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For believing in my work. For defending it." I was only being honest. When was the last time someone defended your work that passionately? The question hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't remember. Richard had never been hostile to my writing, but he'd never championed it either. He'd treated it like an amusing quirk, something to be tolerated rather than celebrated. "Come on," David said, sensing my distress. "I know a place we can get coffee and talk without being surrounded by witnesses to my existential crisis." The cafe he chose was small and unpretentious, with mismatched furniture and local art covering every available wall space. We settled into a corner booth, and I found myself studying his hands as he wrapped them around his coffee mug. Artist's hands, long fingers stained with paint, calloused from years of gripping brushes and palette knives. "Tell me about your writing," he said. "There's nothing to tell." "I doubt that." "What did you write about?" I hesitated, then decided honesty was less dangerous than the growing intimacy of our careful conversations around the truth. "Women, mostly. Women at crossroads, making impossible choices. Marriage and identity, duty versus desire. The usual suburban angst." "Sounds like you were writing what you knew." "Maybe. Or maybe I was writing what I feared." "Which was?" Disappearing. Becoming so absorbed in someone else's life that I forgot I had my own. David reached across the table and covered my hand with his. The gesture was gentle, comforting, but I felt it like an electrical shock. You haven't disappeared, he said softly. You're right here. I can see you. David. I know. I know this is complicated and probably impossible and definitely not what either of us planned. But I need you to know that when I look at you, I don't see Richard's wife or anyone's supporting character. I see a brilliant, passionate woman who's been convinced she's ordinary. My eyes filled with tears I didn't expect. You don't understand. I am ordinary. I'm middle-aged and set in my ways and completely out of practice at being anything other than what I've been for 20 years. You think ordinariness is about age or routine or playing it safe. But real ordinariness is about giving up. And you haven't given up. You're here, in this gallery, defending my art and remembering what you love. That's not ordinary. That's brave. We kissed then, right there in the cafe with the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows and folk music playing softly in the background. It was different from our first kiss, less desperate, more certain. A choice rather than an accident. When we broke apart, I was trembling. This changes everything, I whispered. Maybe, he replied, his thumb tracing the line of my cheek. Or maybe it just clarifies what was already true. We drove home in relative silence, the air between us charged with possibility and consequence. As I pulled into our driveway, I caught sight of our house, the perfectly manicured lawn, the pristine exterior, the two-car garage that contained Richard's sedan and my practical SUV. Everything looked exactly the same. But the woman getting out of the car, walking toward that front door with David beside her, was someone entirely different from the one who'd left that morning. And there was no going back. The house felt different when we walked through the front door, charged with possibility, heavy with the weight of unspoken decisions. David closed the door behind us with deliberate care, the soft click of the lock echoing in the hallway like a final commitment. I stood in my own entryway, keys still in my hand, suddenly hyper-aware of every detail. The way the late afternoon light filtered through the side light windows, casting geometric patterns on the hardwood floor. The familiar scent of the vanilla candles I kept in the living room. The sound of the refrigerator humming from the kitchen, marking time in our too-quiet house. Would you like some wine? I asked, my voice unnaturally bright. I have a bottle of Pinot Grigio that Richard brought back from his last business trip. Are you nervous? David asked gently. I set my keys on the hall table with unnecessary precision. Should I be? I don't know. Should you? He was giving me space to change my mind, to retreat into the safety of our carefully maintained boundaries. But standing there in my hallway, looking at this man who saw me as someone worth pursuing, I realized I was tired of being careful. Tired of living a life designed around avoiding complications rather than embracing possibilities. Yes, I said quietly. I should be terrified. But I'm not. What are you? I considered the question seriously. What was I? Not the dutiful wife who'd driven to the gallery that morning. Not the woman who'd spent 20 years prioritizing everyone else's needs above her own. Something had shifted during our day together, some internal barrier had dissolved, and I couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Awake, I said finally. For the first time in years, I feel completely awake. David stepped closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, the slight scar on his chin that I hadn't noticed before. Close enough to smell his soap and the faint traces of paint that seemed permanently embedded in his skin. I don't want to hurt you, he said softly. You won't. I might. This situation, it's complicated in ways neither of us can control. I know. I reached up to touch his face, marveling at my own boldness. But David, I've been protecting myself from hurt for so long that I forgot what it felt like to actually live. To want something badly enough to risk everything for it. Is that what you're doing? Risking everything? The question hung between us like a challenge. Was I? My marriage, my security, my carefully constructed life, all of it balanced precariously on this moment, this choice. Maybe, I whispered. Does that scare you? It terrifies me, he admitted. But not enough to walk away. We moved toward each other then, not with the desperate urgency of our previous kisses, but with the slow certainty of people who'd already decided. His hands found my face, my hair, my shoulders, as if he were trying to memorize me through touch. I felt beautiful under his gaze, desired in a way I'd forgotten was possible. The house seemed to hold its breath around us. No ticking clocks, no humming appliances, no distant traffic sounds. Just two people standing in a shaft of golden light, crossing a line they could never uncross. We moved upstairs without discussion, as if we'd choreographed this moment in advance. Not to my bedroom, that felt like a violation too profound to contemplate, but to the guest room, among his canvases and paint-stained clothes and the creative chaos that had drawn me to him from the beginning. He lit a small candle he'd placed on the dresser, and the warm light transformed the space into something magical, removed from the ordinary world where wives didn't betray their husbands and young men didn't seduce women old enough to be their mothers. But I wasn't anyone's mother, and he wasn't seducing me. We were two adults, drawn together by mutual attraction and shared longing, choosing to act on feelings we could no longer deny. Are you sure? He asked one last time. Instead of answering, I kissed him, pouring 20 years of suppressed desire into that single gesture. We spent the night together. I woke before dawn, disoriented by the unfamiliar ceiling, the scent of candle wax and paint fumes, the weight of an arm across my waist. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or why my body felt so perfectly relaxed, so completely satisfied. Then memory flooded back, and with it, a complex mixture of emotions I wasn't prepared to process. Euphoria at the discovery that I was still capable of passion. Wonder at how natural it had felt to be with David, how right it seemed despite every rational argument against it. And underneath it all, the first stirrings of panic as reality began to reassert itself. What had I done? David stirred beside me, his breathing changing as he moved toward consciousness. I studied his profile in the gray pre-dawn light, the strong line of his jaw, the dark lashes against his cheek, the way his hair fell across his forehead. He looked younger in sleep, more vulnerable, and I felt a protective tenderness that surprised me with its intensity. This wasn't just physical attraction, I realized with growing alarm. This wasn't a simple case of middle-aged rebellion or sexual frustration. Something deeper had happened between us, something that went beyond the boundaries of a temporary affair. I was falling in love with him. The thought terrified me more than the guilt, more than the fear of discovery, more than any of the practical consequences I'd been trying not to consider. Love complicated everything, made clean breaks impossible, transformed what might have been a manageable mistake into something that could destroy multiple lives. David's eyes opened, and he smiled when he saw me watching him. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning." He reached for me, but I pulled back slightly, suddenly acutely aware of my naked vulnerability, of how exposed I was in every sense. "Regrets already?" he asked, reading my expression with uncomfortable accuracy. "I don't know. Maybe. I need time to think." "About what?" "About everything. About what this means, what happens next, how I stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of questions I couldn't answer. David sat up, running his hands through his hair. "We don't have to figure everything out right now. Don't we? Richard comes back tonight." I have to face him, pretend nothing's changed, act like the wife I was yesterday morning. And what if you can't? The question I'd been trying not to ask myself. What if I couldn't go back to being the woman who'd sleepwalked through her own life for 20 years? What if last night had changed me in ways that couldn't be hidden or reversed? I have to, I said, more to convince myself than him. Do you want to? I looked around the room, at his paintings leaning against the walls, at our clothes scattered on the floor, at the evidence of a night that had altered the fundamental architecture of my existence. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know anything anymore. David reached for my hand, and this time I didn't pull away. That's okay, he said gently. Not knowing is terrifying, but it's also the beginning of possibility. Outside, I could hear the first birds beginning their morning chorus, and somewhere in the distance, a car engine starting. The ordinary world was waking up, resuming its familiar patterns, while I lay in a stranger's arms trying to figure out how to rejoin it. The woman who would go downstairs and make coffee, who would shower and dress and prepare for Richard's return, would look exactly like the woman who'd lived in this house for 20 years. But she would be someone entirely different, carrying secrets that could either destroy her or set her free. And I had no idea which it would be. The morning passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. I made breakfast, though neither David nor I ate much. We moved around each other carefully in the kitchen, hyper-aware of every accidental touch, every meaningful glance. The previous night hung between us like a bridge we'd crossed but couldn't yet acknowledge. David spent most of the day in his room, working on a new painting he claimed had come to him in a dream. I busied myself with household tasks, laundry, grocery shopping, preparing for Richard's return, but every mundane activity felt surreal, as if I were playing a role in a production I no longer understood. The guilt hit me in waves. Not the crushing, devastating guilt I'd expected, but something more complex. Guilt mixed with exhilaration. Shame tempered by a sense of awakening so profound it felt like rebirth. I'd betrayed my marriage, but I'd also reclaimed something essential about myself that I'd thought was lost forever. I found myself checking my reflection obsessively throughout the day, convinced that what had happened must be written on my face. But the woman in the mirror looked exactly the same, maybe a little brighter around the eyes, perhaps carrying herself with slightly more confidence, but nothing that would raise suspicions. By afternoon, I'd almost convinced myself that I could manage this. That I could compartmentalize what had happened with David, file it away as a beautiful aberration that didn't have to define my future. I would be more careful, create appropriate boundaries, perhaps suggest he find other accommodations sooner than planned. It was a reasonable strategy. Mature, practical, minimally destructive. It lasted exactly until Richard called. "Flight's been delayed," he said, his voice crackling through a poor connection. "Won't be home until tomorrow morning. Hope you and David are managing okay without me." "We're fine," I managed, though the words felt like glass in my throat. "Good. Listen, I've been thinking, maybe we should plan a vacation this summer. Somewhere tropical. You've seemed restless lately, and I think a change of scenery might do us both good." A vacation. Just the two of us, in some beautiful resort, trying to recreate the romance we'd lost years ago. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the evidence that he'd noticed my discontent even if he'd misdiagnosed the cause, made everything infinitely worse. "That sounds wonderful," I lied. "Great. We can look at some options when I get back." "Love you." "Love you too." I hung up the phone and immediately burst into tears, great, gulping sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. The kind of crying that felt like purging, like my body was trying to expel the contradictions I could no longer contain. David found me on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, mascara probably streaked down my cheeks in dark tributaries. "What happened?" he asked, kneeling beside me. "Richard," I managed between sobs. He wants to take me on vacation. He's trying to fix things, and he doesn't even know they're broken. David didn't say anything, just pulled me against his chest and let me cry. His silence was more comforting than any platitudes would have been. I'm a terrible person, I whispered into his shirt. No, you're not. You're a person in an impossible situation. I love my husband. Not the way I should, maybe not the way I once did, but I do love him. And I'm destroying our marriage for something that can't possibly last. Who says it can't last? I pulled back to look at him. David, be realistic. You're 26 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you, opportunities one can't even imagine. What future could we possibly have? I don't know. But does that mean we shouldn't try to find out? Yes, I said firmly. It absolutely means that. Because trying means destroying other people's lives in the process. What about your life? When do you get to consider what you want? I'm 47. I made my choices 20 years ago. Those choices don't have to be permanent. They do when other people's happiness depends on them. David sat back on his heels, studying my face. Are you happy? In this marriage, in this life you're so determined to protect? Happiness isn't the only consideration. It should be one of them. We stared at each other across the kitchen tiles, two people who'd shared the most intimate possible connection just hours earlier, now facing the impossibility of our situation in the harsh light of practical reality. Richard's flight is delayed, I said finally. He won't be home until tomorrow. Meaning? Meaning we have 18 more hours to pretend this is sustainable. David's smile was sad but understanding. 18 hours to live in possibility before we return to responsibility? Something like that. He stood and extended his hand to help me up. Then let's not waste them. But even as I took his hand, even as I let him pull me to my feet and lead me back upstairs, I knew we were only postponing the inevitable. Some boundaries, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Some choices, once made, couldn't be unmade. And some kinds of love, no matter how unexpected or inconvenient or impossible, couldn't be ignored. The problem was that I no longer had any idea which kind of love would ultimately prove stronger, the comfortable, established love that had sustained my marriage for 20 years, or this new, terrifying, transformative love that threatened to consume everything in its path. All I knew was that by tomorrow night, when Richard was home and we'd resumed our normal routines, I would have to choose. And I was terrified of what that choice might be. I spent Richard's final night away in a state of controlled panic, alternating between desperate attempts to memorize every moment with David and equally desperate attempts to prepare myself for his eventual departure. Because he would leave, if not immediately, then soon. Young men with talent and ambition didn't stay in suburban guest bedrooms indefinitely, especially when their presence had become a source of dangerous complications. We didn't speak about the future. Instead, we existed in a bubble of present-tense intensity, talking about art and poetry and the thousand small observations that had drawn us together. David sketched while I read, occasionally looking up to study my profile with the focused attention he brought to all his subjects. "What are you thinking about?" he asked during one of these moments. How strange it is to feel like myself again. I'd forgotten what that felt like. What does it feel like? I considered the question seriously. Like I have opinions that matter. Like my thoughts are worth expressing. Like I'm more than the sum of my domestic functions. You were always more than that. You just needed someone to remind you. Or someone to see it in the first place. That night, we didn't make love with the desperate passion of our first time, but with something deeper, a tenderness that acknowledged both the beauty of what we'd found and the impossibility of keeping it. We spent the night together, but it felt like goodbye. Richard returned the next morning with flowers and plans for our imaginary vacation. He seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of reconnecting, making an effort that would have delighted me 6 months earlier. Now it felt like watching someone try to resuscitate something that had already died. "You look good," he said, kissing my cheek. "Rested. The time alone must have agreed with you." If only he knew. "It was quiet," I said carefully. "Peaceful." David appeared just as we were finishing breakfast, and I watched Richard's face carefully for any sign of suspicion. But he saw only his nephew, perhaps a bit more subdued than usual, but nothing to cause alarm. "Hope we weren't too boring company," Richard said. "Not at all. Your wife showed me some wonderful local galleries. Really opened my eyes to the art scene here." "That's great. She's always been into that cultural stuff. Good to know it's finally useful for something." The casual dismissiveness in Richard's tone made me flinch. This was how he spoke about my interests, not with hostility, but with the kind of benign condescension that was somehow worse. As if everything I cared about was charming but ultimately irrelevant. David's eyes met mine across the table, and I saw understanding there. He'd heard it too. The next few days passed in a surreal pantomime of normalcy. Richard threw himself back into work with renewed energy, David maintained the fiction of being a grateful houseguest, and I played the role of the contented wife with increasing difficulty. But the undercurrents were impossible to ignore. David and I moved around each other with careful formality in Richard's presence, but the air between us remained charged. Every accidental touch, every shared glance, every moment of forced casual conversation felt like walking across a minefield. Richard, perhaps motivated by guilt over his long hours or genuine desire to improve our marriage, made unprecedented efforts to spend time with me. He came home early twice that week, suggested dinner at our favorite restaurant, even asked about my opinion on the vacation destination. His attention should have pleased me. Instead, it felt suffocating, like being forced to wear clothes that no longer fit. The breaking point came Thursday evening. Richard had surprised me with tickets to a symphony performance, my favorite composer, seats he must have paid premium prices for. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture the old me would have treasured. But sitting in the concert hall, listening to Brahms while Richard held my hand with practiced affection, I felt like I was watching my life from outside my body. The woman in the expensive dress, with the attentive husband and the suburban home and the secure future, was a stranger wearing my face. During intermission, while Richard went to get drinks, I sat alone in our seats and felt tears threatening. Not tears of sadness, exactly, but tears of recognition. I was mourning the death of the person I'd been for 20 years, the woman who would have been grateful for this evening, who would have seen it as evidence of her husband's love rather than proof of how little he truly knew her. "You're very quiet tonight," Richard observed during the drive home. "Just enjoying the music." "Good. I thought you might appreciate something more sophisticated than our usual evening entertainment." Something about his tone, the slight emphasis on sophisticated, the implication that this was a special treat rather than something I was capable of appreciating regularly, made me snap. "I appreciate music every day, Richard. I don't need special occasions to enjoy culture." He glanced at me in surprise. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I just thought you'd enjoy getting out of the house for something elegant. As opposed to my usual unsophisticated pursuits." "That's not what I said. It's what you implied." We drove the rest of the way in silence, and I realized with growing alarm that I was picking a fight with my husband based on perceived slights that might have been entirely innocent. The guilt was eating me alive, but instead of confessing or finding healthy ways to address it, I was projecting my self-loathing onto Richard's well-meaning gestures. Back home, I went straight upstairs while Richard checked his email. David was in his room with the door closed, but I could see light under the gap and hear the soft sounds of movement. Part of me wanted to knock, to seek comfort in his presence, but that way lay madness. Instead, I lay in bed beside my sleeping husband and tried to figure out how to extricate myself from a situation that was becoming more impossible by the day. I was falling deeper in love with David, growing more resentful of Richard's obliviousness, and becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of deception and betrayal and increasingly elaborate justifications for both. Something had to give. And I was terrified it would be my sanity. The crisis came, as these things do, from an unexpected direction. I'd been so focused on managing the emotional complexity of my situation that I'd forgotten about the practical risks of conducting an affair under my husband's nose. Friday afternoon, while Richard was at his office and David was at a coffee shop downtown sketching potential gallery submissions, I decided to do something normal and domestically responsible: laundry. I gathered clothes from the guest room hamper, not thinking about what I might find there. It wasn't until I was sorting darks from lights that I discovered the evidence of my betrayal, a wine stain on one of David's shirts that I remembered from our first night together, when I'd accidentally spilled Pinot Grigio while reaching for his hand. Mixed in with his clothes was one of my scarves, the silk one I'd been wearing to the gallery that day, somehow transferred to his room and forgotten. Holding that scarf, I felt the full weight of how careless I'd been. How many other small pieces of evidence might exist? How many tiny betrayals of our secret were scattered throughout the house like landmines waiting to explode? I was stuffing the scarf into my pocket when I heard Richard's car in the driveway. 2 hours early, again. His new pattern of unexpected homecomings that had seemed so romantic a week ago now felt like surveillance. "Hello," he called from downstairs. "In the laundry room," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady. He appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie. "Thought I'd come home early and see if you wanted to grab dinner somewhere. Maybe start looking at those vacation brochures." "That sounds lovely." I turned back to the washing machine, hiding my face. "Just let me finish this load." "What's that?" He was looking at something on the floor, David's paint-stained jeans, which had fallen from the pile when I'd grabbed my scarf. "Laundry," I said stupidly. "I can see that. But since when do you wash David's clothes?" My mind scrambled for a reasonable explanation. He asked if he could throw a few things in with our load. "To save water." Richard picked up the jeans, examining the paint stains with more interest than seemed warranted. "Quite a bit of paint on these. He must be working on something major." "I think he is." "A new series," he mentioned. Richard continued studying the jeans with an expression I couldn't read. "You know, I've been meaning to ask, how has he been as a houseguest? Not too disruptive to your routine?" "Not at all. He's very considerate." "Good. Because I got a call today from a gallery in New York. They're interested in showing his work, but they want him there next week for a consultation. If it goes well, he might be relocating sooner than expected." The words hit me like a physical blow. David was leaving. Of course he was. Ambitious artists didn't stay in suburban guest bedrooms indefinitely. But hearing it stated so matter-of-factly, learning that plans were being made without my knowledge, brought home the temporary nature of everything we'd built. "That's wonderful news," I managed. "A real opportunity for him." "Yes, it is. He's talented, and he deserves a chance to make something of himself." Richard's tone was casual, conversational, but something in his expression made me look at him more carefully. There was a watchfulness there that hadn't been present before, a subtle shift in the way he was observing me. "Did you know he's been writing poetry?" Richard continued. "Found some pages on the printer yesterday. Quite good, actually, though rather intense." My blood turned to ice. "Poetry?" "Love poems, I think. Very passionate stuff. The kind of thing young men write when they're He paused, still watching my face. When they're inspired by someone special. The scarf in my pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric. Richard knew. Maybe not the full extent of what had happened, but he suspected something. The careful way he was speaking, the pointed nature of his observations, this wasn't casual conversation. "I'm sure you're reading too much into it," I said carefully. "Artists are often dramatic in their expression." Perhaps. Though there was one line that particularly struck me, the afternoon light on her skin was like redemption. Rather specific imagery for general artistic inspiration. I couldn't breathe. The poem he was describing, I remembered David writing it, sitting in the guest room while I read nearby, occasionally looking up to study my face before returning to his notebook. I'd felt flattered by his attention, never thinking about where those observations might end up. "Richard. I'm not accusing anyone of anything," he said mildly, folding David's jeans with unnecessary care. "I'm simply observant. And lately, I've observed that my wife seems different. Happier, maybe. More alive. And my nephew seems quite taken with our local cultural offerings." We stared at each other across the laundry room, 23 years of marriage and a week of betrayal hanging between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. "I should get dinner started," I said finally. "Yes," Richard agreed. "You should." He left me alone with the washing machine and the weight of discovery. Not the dramatic confrontation I'd imagined, not angry accusations or demands for confession. Just the quiet, terrible acknowledgement that our marriage had entered new territory, and none of us knew the rules anymore. David returned an hour later, full of excitement about the gallery opportunity. But one look at my face stopped his enthusiasm cold. "What's wrong?" "Richard knows," I whispered. "Not everything, but enough." "How?" "Your poetry. He found some pages you'd printed. And he's been watching us, noticing things." I sank into a kitchen chair. "David, you need to take that New York opportunity. You need to leave before this gets worse. I'm not leaving you to deal with this alone. You have to. Don't you see? This is exactly what I was afraid of. People getting hurt, lives getting destroyed. If you stay, it will only get more complicated." "And if I leave?" I looked at him standing in my kitchen, paint under his fingernails, concern etched across his beautiful face, and felt my heart breaking in real time. "If you leave, maybe Richard and I can find a way to rebuild what we had. Maybe I can learn to be satisfied with enough again." "Is that what you want?" "It's what's right." "That's not what I asked." Before I could answer, Richard appeared in the doorway, and the three of us stood frozen in a tableau of suburban disaster, the husband, the wife, and the young man who'd unknowingly lit the fuse that would blow their carefully constructed world apart. "Dinner ready?" Richard asked pleasantly. "Almost," I replied. "Good. We have a lot to discuss." And with those 5 words, I knew that the reckoning I'd been dreading was finally at hand. The confrontation didn't come that night, or even the next day. Instead, Richard orchestrated something far more sophisticated than the explosive scene I'd been expecting, a slow, methodical tightening of screws that left me questioning my own sanity. Saturday morning, he suggested we all go to the farmer's market together. "Like a family," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. David and I had no choice but to agree, and we spent 2 hours performing normalcy while Richard watched our every interaction with the focused attention of a scientist observing specimens. When David reached for the same tomato I was examining, Richard materialized beside us. When we laughed at something the herb vendor said, Richard asked what was so funny. When David offered to carry my bags, Richard insisted on taking them himself. "No need to burden our guest with errands," he said pleasantly. By Sunday, the tension was unbearable. David spent most of the day locked in his room, ostensibly packing for his New York trip. I threw myself into deep cleaning projects that didn't need doing, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless just to avoid the weight of Richard's observation. "You're very energetic today," Richard commented, finding me reorganizing the linen closet for the third time. "Spring cleaning," I said without looking at him. "In the middle of summer? I like things to be organized." "Yes, you do. Though I've noticed you've been less organized recently. More spontaneous. Take that gallery visit with David, for instance. Very unlike you to spend an entire day on cultural pursuits without checking with me first." I forced myself to meet his eyes. I didn't realize I needed permission to visit a gallery. "Of course not. I'm simply observing that your behavior has become unpredictable." "Not necessarily in a bad way," he added quickly. "Change can be healthy. As long as it doesn't become destructive." The word destructive hung in the air like a threat. Monday morning brought the inevitable. Richard announced he was taking the day off work to spend time with David before his departure. "Thought we'd have a proper uncle-nephew conversation," he said over breakfast. "Man to man. There are things that need to be discussed." David's face went pale, but he nodded. "Of course." They disappeared into Richard's study after breakfast, and I was left to imagine the worst. Was Richard confronting him directly? Threatening him? Demanding details about our relationship? The thought of David being forced to lie or, worse, tell the truth, made me physically sick. I was loading the dishwasher when David emerged from the study alone, his face grim. "Where's Richard?" I asked. "Taking a shower. We need to talk." "What did he say to you?" "He knows, but he doesn't want to know officially. He's giving me an out, take the New York opportunity, leave quietly, and nothing more needs to be said." "And if you don't?" He made it clear that would be inadvisable. For everyone involved. I set down the plate I'd been holding. "So this is it. You're leaving. Tomorrow morning. Early flight." We stared at each other across my kitchen, both of us understanding that this was goodbye. Not the passionate, desperate goodbye of lovers torn apart by circumstance, but the quiet, necessary goodbye of people who'd made impossible choices and now had to live with the consequences. "I'm glad," I said, though the words felt like lies. "This is how it should end." "Is it?" "Yes. Clean break, no one gets destroyed. We go back to our lives." "What if I don't want to go back to my life?" "Then you build a new one. In New York, with people who can give you what you need." "What if what I need is you?" The question I'd been afraid he'd ask, the one I couldn't answer honestly without destroying everything. "Then you learn to need something else," I said firmly. Because yes, it was beautiful, but it was never sustainable. That evening, we had our last dinner together as a trio. Richard was charming, expansive, talking about David's bright future in New York and all the opportunities waiting for a talented young artist. David played his part perfectly, expressing gratitude for their hospitality and excitement about his new adventure. I said very little, focused on memorizing details I'd need later, the way David held his fork, the sound of his laugh when Richard told a story about his own youthful ambitions, the careful way he avoided meeting my eyes. After dinner, David excused himself to finish packing. Richard and I cleaned up together in companionable silence, performing the domestic ritual we'd perfected over 20 years of marriage. "I think this has been good for him," Richard said as we finished. "The time here helped him gain some perspective." "I hope so. And for you too, I think. You've seemed more yourself lately. More like the woman I married." I looked at him sharply, but his expression was unreadable. "I should go help him pack," I said. Of course. Though I suspect he can manage on his own. The warning was subtle but clear. Richard had given us our goodbye conversation downstairs, in public. There would be no private farewell, no last stolen moments. I went upstairs anyway, but David's door was already closed. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, my hand raised to knock, knowing that everything I wanted to say would have to remain unsaid. In the morning, Richard drove David to the airport. They left before I woke up, or before I admitted to being awake. I found a note on the kitchen counter, "Thank you for everything. You helped me find my voice. I hope you remember yours." No signature, no address, no promise to stay in touch. Just the acknowledgement of what we'd meant to each other and the understanding that it was over. Richard returned from the airport with coffee and my favorite pastries from the French bakery downtown. "Thought we might start fresh," he said, setting the bag on the counter. "Plan that vacation. Maybe rediscover some things we've forgotten about each other." I looked at him, this man I'd been married to for 23 years, who was offering me forgiveness without making me ask for it, who was choosing to rebuild rather than destroy, and felt something complex and painful settle in my chest. Not love, exactly. Not the consuming passion I'd discovered with David. But something deeper, perhaps. Partnership. Understanding. The recognition that some commitments transcend desire, that some bonds survive even betrayal. "I'd like that," I said, and meant it. But as we sat at our kitchen table planning our future, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was looking at my life through glass, seeing it clearly, understanding its value, but somehow unable to fully inhabit it. David was gone, taking with him the woman I'd briefly become. What remained was the question of whether I could learn to be satisfied with who I'd always been, or whether I'd spend the rest of my marriage mourning the possibility of who I might have been. The answer, I suspected, would take years to discover.